Hi, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. With me is Steve Ducey, who is an actor and an activist, and he's here to talk about his latest endeavor, No Olympics LA. How you doing, Steve?
I'm doing well, Lauren. Thanks so much for having me on.
Sure thing. So before we get into No Olympics and what that's all about, why don't you tell us how you became an activist and the group that you're working with?
Yeah, so I've always been somebody who's been very politically aware. I've always followed politics very closely, but it wasn't really until the election of Donald Trump, like a lot of people in this country, that I really decided to take my political awareness and turn it into political action. And it really didn't kind of coalesce until he was actually inaugurated. And that's when I decided that it was going to be time to actually do something. And so my first foray into this began with the Measure H campaign in March. And I started canvassing on behalf of that ballot measure because I've seen the homelessness crisis and how it's gotten so bad in the last few years here in Los Angeles. And then that brought me to the Democratic Socialists of America, Los Angeles, and their Housing and Homelessness Committee. And I joined up with them and haven't really looked back ever since.
Yes, well, I know that DSA Los Angeles has gained 1,000 new members since the Bernie Sanders campaign. Do you want to tell people a little bit about DSA? Because a lot of people think it's an actual party that runs candidates, and it actually doesn't.
That's correct. Yeah. Democratic Socialists of America is the largest socialist organization in the country. Nationally, its membership has tripled since the November election. While there are candidates who now currently hold public office who are DSA members, DSA is not a political party. It does not run candidates. We are a political organization, and we're a multi-tendency political organization that has a pretty open door policy to membership. We don't have a litmus test or anything for membership, but generally speaking, everybody that's in the organization is pretty anti-capitalist.
But it's not one of those groups where you go to meetings and you have to sit there and read Marx and Lenin and Gramsci and Trotsky. It's not one of those theoretical type groups, is it?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely people in the organization who are very, deeply knowledgeable of those theoretical debates and, are very vocal about them. But ultimately, we have a very open door policy. We want to welcome all comers and, take people's talents and use them to the best of their abilities to affect political change. That's our real ultimate goal, is how can we make the world a better place?
Now, tell us a little bit about the Housing and Homeless Committee, because that's what led into the No Olympics movement. What other things, before we talk about the Olympics, have they been working on besides Measure H?
So this was kind of a natural transition for us because the Olympics really touches on a lot of the things that we're really passionate about as an organization. Some of the various different things that we're working on with regards to housing and homelessness, as I'm sure you know, and many of your listeners and viewers know, LA is currently in an affordable housing crisis. It's in a homelessness crisis. The homeless count that just came out last week, homelessness jumped 23% last year. And so we're really seeing how the lack of access to affordable housing is directly tied to the homelessness crisis in the city and in the state and also throughout the country. And so some of the things that we're working on are focusing on things like Ellis Act reform, Ellis Act, which is the statewide law that allows owners of property to evict their tenants, Costa-Hawkins reform, which is the state law to limit the ability for municipalities to enact a stronger rent control, linkage fees, which is a way to put a fee on developers to create funding for affordable housing. And just various other issues, city planning, things that are causing the housing crisis to get worse and thus the homelessness crisis to get worse.
Yes, and this is going to be a very big issue with the Bernie-crats this year and with the Democratic Party in general. I was just up covering the state convention 2 weeks ago, and the resolution that got the most applause and the most excitement amongst the delegates was the renters' rights resolution, basically declaring housing a human right. And I've been talking with Bernie-crats from San Francisco to San Diego about how we have to address affordable housing. And I don't want to get into it in this show, but I happen to be one of the few progressives who was for Measure S, because I thought that it would really force the city to use some of the 9,000 parcels that it has for public housing. Because I personally think that keeping housing in the private sector is never going to work. And the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So we've had this sort of public-private partnership where we've expected the developers to provide this affordable housing, and it hasn't gotten any more affordable. In fact, it's gotten worse.
Precisely. And I think we've seen that just with Garcetti's plan to try to curb homelessness. One of the key planks of his plan was to have developers purchase public land and turn it into affordable housing. And no developers did that because developers aren't interested in doing that because that doesn't make developers any money.
Right. I mean, this is neoliberalism. I mean, people who watch my show know that I'm always railing against neoliberalism because it's all about putting everything in the hands of the private sector, including public goods and services. And that cannot be done by the private sector because, like you said, the profit motive is not going to work when you're dealing with things that are human rights, be they healthcare, be they education, be they housing. So it's very important to declare housing now a human right. Okay, let's talk about the Olympics. So I heard about this twice, once at a ground game meeting I went to, which is the new group that came out of the Jessica Salins campaign. And then the second time was last Thursday, where a couple of your cohorts there were at the Dave Zirin lecture. And he writes about the intersection of sports and politics. I'm going to have him on my show, folks. So that's going to be a great show because he's a fantastic guest, very informative. Everything I know about sports, I know from him because I don't follow sports, but I follow his work. So I learn a little bit through his articles. Anyway, tell me about No Olympics. I mean, we're supposed to think that the Olympics are great because they bring all sorts of business to the city. They bring tourist dollars. They bring jobs. And the taxpayers don't have to pay a dime. Is that not true?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's not true. Ultimately, our criticism with bringing the Olympic Games to Los Angeles is something that you've seen in cities throughout the world, is that the two primary problems with what the Olympics does is it creates an increased militarization of the police force, and it also leads to the acceleration of gentrification and displacement. LA is, this touches precisely on many of the areas that DSA is already working on. The displacement and gentrification issue is right in the wheelhouse of what we're doing with the Housing and Homelessness Committee. And then the increased militarization of the police force ties in directly with what our Sanctuary City Working Group has been working on. And that is what a lot of organizations in Los Angeles have been working on, and that is resisting the presence of ICE in LA. And we're definitely seeing that as part of the LA 2024 bid process, that their planning for how they're bringing the games to Los Angeles is only going to make these two things much, much worse.
So let me ask you about that, because Dave Zirin referenced Mike Davis's famous book, City of Quartz, about Los Angeles. And in that book, he talked about how the preparation for the '84 Olympics under Police Chief Daryl Gates led to the militarization of the police force and ultimately to the civil unrest in 1992. Is that the kind of thing that you're worried about?
Yeah, precisely. And, there's a lot of evidence to back that up. I mean, Daryl Gates, the infamous former LA police chief, was operational and instrumental in things like the Hammer Unit and Operation Crash. And these were, these widespread gang sweeps that were going into immigrant communities that are predominantly lower income, predominantly people of color, and sweeping people up who they believed to have any kind of ties to gangs. And that didn't necessarily mean that they were gang members. It just meant that they had gang ties. And that was a very broad definition that they used to basically trample on people's civil rights, put them in prison for weeks at a time without any kind of due process. And what happens is when you create these militarized police tactics, they don't just go away the day that the Olympics are gone. These are things that get baked into the very DNA of LAPD. And there is a lot of evidence to show that those kind of tactics and those kind of technologies and things that were brought on and adapted to LAPD were directly linked to the civil unrest that occurred in 1992. And we would be absolutely naive to think that the situation in 2017 is in any way better. We are already seeing, calls for Charlie Beck to be fired by the Black Lives Matter movement. And we've seen how LAPD has become one of the most highly technologically advanced and highly militarized police forces in the United States. And they're also one of the deadliest police forces in the United States. They had more civilian involved killings last year than any other police force in America. And where this is really scary is that as part of LA 2024's bid process, they want to create the LA Games as designate them as a national special security event. And what that means is that LAPD is now being controlled by the Department of Homeland Security and the Secret Service. Well, one of the governmental organizations that is under the jurisdiction of the Department of Homeland Security is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which means that hundreds, if not thousands, of ICE officers are going to be roaming the streets of LA, plugged directly into the LAPD database, and we're going to see the kind of mass deportations that we've already seen accelerate under the Trump administration ramp up even more.
Now, wait a minute there, because Garcetti has clearly said, and Chief Charlie Beck has clearly said, that they have no intention of coordinating with ICE. And they are very much against Trump and his plans. So why do you think things would be different?
Well, because we really feel that Garcetti is kind of talking out of both sides of his mouth on this issue. He is giving somewhat decent lip service to the idea of not coordinating with ICE and not, and declaring LA a not fully sanctuary city. He's been very weak and meek on this issue. There was a great article in The Intercept that pointed this out as well, that said that while Garcetti is talking about, flirting with the idea of LA being a sanctuary city, they are still collaborating with ICE, and they are still having, ICE in our jails. We've seen these widespread ICE raids that have happened just recently, and the kind of thing that kidnapped immigrant activist Claudia Rueda. Right.
Well, it's interesting because Garcetti is clearly angling for higher office. Some think he wants to run for president in 2020, and therefore he's kind of playing both sides off against the middle in very many areas. I think in this situation, he doesn't want to aggravate Trump because he does want to have the Olympics here. So, it's just something about him that, doesn't sit well with me. I mean, I think he's a progressive in his heart, but he's really not a progressive in his actions. And it's very hard, as Bernie Sanders has showed us. Sometimes you have to take unpopular positions, but they're the right positions, they're the moral positions, they're the just positions. And if you keep taking these positions for 40 years, as Bernie has done, then you too can become the most popular politician in America. Eric Garcetti should take a page from Bernie Sanders' playbook, in my estimation.
Precisely. And so much of this stuff is all tied together because, another area where Garcetti is having to go to the Trump administration for support is on something like transit expansion. And that transit expansion is directly tied to his desire to bring the Olympic Games to LA. And so it's very hard for him to take a hard line on something like sanctuary cities because it jeopardizes his ability to secure this transport financing in order to accelerate the Purple Line expansion so that it can be ready in time for the 2024 Games.
Exactly. Now, unless you want to say anything more about the militarization of the police, I'd like to get into the gentrification and displacement aspect. Can you tell our viewers exactly how you think that's going to happen?
Right.
And how it actually did happen before.
Yeah, exactly. So this is something that we've seen happen in Olympic cities throughout the world. It happened in London. It happened in Vancouver. Rio is a particularly egregious example of this as well, is that the Olympics becomes this opportunity for real estate developers and people who are moneyed interest with as far as accelerating projects to use the Olympic Games as an excuse to advance development that gentrifies and displaces lower income people. And while the LA 2024 bid is being billed as something that is going to be very low risk because they're not going to have to build these new stadium venues that end up becoming white elephants like cities like Rio did, that doesn't change the fact that developers are still going to see this as an opportunity to cash in. And there's going to be remodeling done on things like the Coliseum. We're already seeing it now with the Inglewood Stadium that's going to be built for the LA Rams. That large parcel of land was purchased by a developer out there to build high-priced condos for Google executives. And you're going to see the advanced gentrification and displacement of people in the Inglewood community. There's particular concern around South Central because that's close to the LA Coliseum and USC, and they've already had problems with displacement. And the Olympic Games is just going to accelerate that.
Right. Now, what are they doing in preparation for that, do you think?
What is the bid committee or the city or?
Well, I mean, because this is going to be in 2024. So What do you think? Are they because there's already that kind of gentrification and displacement. I went to, and I'll be putting it up on my YouTube channel. Peter Moskowitz was in conversation with Tracy Rosenthal, and he just wrote a book on gentrification, and it's already happening in these areas. But you think it's going to be accelerated?
Yeah, precisely. And it's one of those things that doesn't happen just when the games are going on. There's a terrific graph that we have posted on our social media, and I can link that to anybody that's interested in seeing it later on, that was provided to us by some of the opposition groups in Vancouver. And what it shows is that home prices and real estate prices started to skyrocket in Vancouver when they were awarded the bid, not when the games came to Vancouver. So, developers are probably already organizing around this idea right now. They're probably already very excited. They've already got their projects lined up, and they're ready to present them the day that the bid gets awarded to Los Angeles, which we're obviously hoping doesn't happen. And so, you're going to see this continued pouring in of, out of state and international money in these giant projects that aren't serving the needs of working class Angelenos. They're serving the needs of these people who are commodifying housing.
Yeah, and that's another thing. Why isn't he working on, with the same diligence as he's pursuing getting the Olympics here? Why isn't he working on affordable housing and homelessness, Let me ask you a question about something we spoke in the pre-interview. You said to me that the taxpayers may very well be on the hook. Explain that.
Yeah, so, again, LA 2024 is billing this as a very low-risk Olympic Games, but there's no such thing as a no-risk Olympic Games. Every Olympic Games for the last 60 years has gone over budget, to the tune of 152% over budget. The games that are being scheduled right now for Tokyo are already ballooning well beyond budget. And so there's no way to guarantee that this will come in on time and under budget. And with the current agreement that the bid committee has with the city of LA and with the state of California, LA taxpayers are on the hook for the first $250 million of cost overruns, and California taxpayers are on the hook for the next $250 million of cost overruns.
Wow. This reminds me of Jerry Brown's boondoggle project, the Twin Tunnels, which he's trying to sell because of the drought and saying that we need the water. And in fact, it's really going to be just a grab for big ag and big oil. And the ratepayers in Los Angeles are going to be on the hook for it. Instead of spending money to do local water conservation projects and other things, there's, this and his high-speed rail. I mean, they just love these big projects. I mean, somebody's getting paid off here, I'm telling you. There's a lot of big developers that give money to these politicians' campaigns. I mean, even Measure M, I remember being against that because that was something that the construction and the construction developers and the engineering firms and all the consultants, as well as the unions, made a lot of money off of, when in fact, really the money should be going into the bus service, because that's really how poor people get around.
Precisely. And yet again, Measure M, this also, again, it all ties back into the Olympics. We're seeing the priorities for Measure M are expanding the Purple Line to Westwood, which is not really an area of Los Angeles that really needs access to mass transit. People who need mass transit are people who are poor and people who don't have access to cars. The area that is desperately in need of those Measure M funds is the Vermont corridor, and that doesn't break ground until 2024. And the main reason why they're pushing the Purple Line expansion to Westwood is because the bid committee has planned the UCLA campus to be the Olympic Village.
Naturally. Okay. So let's talk about what you've done so far. You mentioned to me that the campaign was launched a month ago. What kinds of things have you done in this campaign? Who are you targeting?
This has been a whirlwind over the past month. Our analysis launched about a month ago tonight. And by Monday morning, we were being inundated with press requests. We've been covered by The Nation, by Vice Sports, by Huffington Post. We've been interviewed by KTLA, by NBC4. The LA Times has covered us. And with not just speaking to the press and releasing information via social media, we've also been in the process of building a strong coalition. And that's been one of the most exciting parts about this. Has been reaching out to tenants' rights organizations, organizations that are working on immigrants' rights, and building a strong coalition of opposition to these games. For more information on our coalition partners, our website has that, but we've got a few of the locals from the LA Tenants Union are on board. A firm is on board, Stop LAPD Spying, and we're bringing on new coalition partners every day. And ultimately, our targets for this are, the mayor's office. Mayor Garcetti is being very publicly in support of bringing the bid to LA. The LA 2024 bid committee, which is chaired by Casey Wasserman. The International Olympic Committee, which is effectively a supranational syndicate that answers to no one but themselves. And also the United States Olympic Committee. And ultimately, our goal is to get LA to drop the bid. We don't want the games here at all.
Wow. Now, you were telling me that you were tweeting to the IOC members and there was a lot of corruption. Can you talk about some of that corruption?
Yeah, there's a great piece in The Nation, again, that the headline is the IOC perfect candidates for a perp walk. You only really have to Google the phrase IOC corruption and you'll get plenty of hits on some of these corruption scandals that a number of the members of the IOC have been involved in. The president of Samsung, I believe, is one of the members of the International Olympic Committee, and he was being charged with corruption. And the IOC basically, looked the other way and allowed him to stay on the board. There was another member of the IOC, and the name is escaping me right now, but he was caught up in a corruption scandal, a pay-for-play scandal that involved FIFA. And Casey Wasserman said, well, that's not a big deal because he's not, that was before he joined the Olympic process. And it's really just kind of a who's who of corrupt international moneyed interests who are ultimately out to gain money for themselves. And a couple of weeks ago, we launched a targeted social media campaign against them, and everything is completely, fact-based and well researched. These are all publicly available facts about these people and the various crimes that they've been involved in.
Now, do they ever tweet you back?
Yeah, we actually did get a little bit of pushback from one of the members of the IOC. He was being pretty vocal in opposition against us, saying that it's not their fault that Rio is falling apart and that there's these white elephant stadiums that in the Amazon that they want to turn into open air prisons. It's not their fault that the medals are falling apart from the Rio Olympic Games. Basically what they do is they constantly are passing the buck on these issues and they never want to take responsibility for when things go wrong, but they want to take all the credit for when things go right, which they don't really ever do.
So what are the next steps? I mean, you have a long time, or actually when are they supposed to make the decision?
So it's interesting. There's been a new wrinkle that's come up in this process. So because so many other cities are rejecting the bid, Boston had a grassroots opposition that got their mayor to drop the bid. Budapest, Rome, a number of other international cities are no longer interested in having the Olympics there. It's funny. Switzerland, which is home to the IOC, actually put it on the ballot, and their citizens voted no to having the Olympics in their home country. So what the official vote is going to take place in Lima, Peru in September. But there's been an interesting wrinkle that has taken place over the last week or so. And that is because so many cities are rejecting the games. There's only two cities that are up for the 2024 games. That's Los Angeles and Paris. And the winds are blowing and saying that Paris is looking like the favorite for 2024. But because the IOC doesn't want to go through this embarrassing bid process again, they're going to be voting on June 9th to authorize themselves to award the 2024 games and the 2028 games at the same time in their vote in September. And the winds are blowing and saying that they're going to give the 2024 games to Paris and the 2028 games to LA.
Now, what does DSA say should be an alternative? Because certainly these games are very enjoyable to watch. I don't watch sports, but occasionally I'll tune into the Olympics. And, the athletes do spend their lives training and excelling, and they deserve to have an opportunity to shine. What do you think could be an alternative to these kinds of things?
Yeah, well, I really feel like, I can only really speak for myself here. I mean, ultimately our organization and our opposition is just, to not have the games in LA. It's a very big task to take on to completely reform the Olympic Games because the IOC is so deeply corrupt and has so many fundamental flaws. But, a good alternative to, instead of letting these cities play host to a billionaire sports party that cripples the city, to have a permanent World Heritage Site that is the host of these games every 4 years or whenever a new body decides to host them. Something like Athens would be maybe a great alternative, the historic home of the Olympic Games. Would be a good opportunity to, still have this event, but without all of the unnecessary negative consequences that are visited upon host cities when they bring the games there.
Right. Now, does LA make money from the sports rights as well? Do you know?
It's interesting. So the International Olympic Committee and what would end up being the LA organizing committee, should the games be awarded to LA, are the ones who kind of determine how the money gets spent and where the money ends up going. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the IOC rakes in, tons of profits from this. And a lot of the quote unquote profits come from sponsorship deals. They come from the broadcast rights and things like that.
That's what I was referring to. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's something that is figured out by the International Olympic Committee and what ends up being the organizing committee. And so and unfortunately, that is not a democratic process. That is not something that the people get a voice in. That is not something that we have the opportunity to say, well, we would like you to take these billions of dollars that you're going to be making and invest them in things that are better for the city, things like affordable housing, things like fixing our homelessness crisis. We would really like to see that if we're not successful in fighting the bid, to have a voice in that process, to say we want any potential benefits of these games to actually be reinvested in the community in a meaningful way.
Well, that leads to Caney Arnold's question here. Can you see that?
A lot of what they say is that the 84 games were profitable. They were the only profitable games in the history, not in the history, but they were one of the shining examples of a profitable Olympics. First off, as a socialist organization, we reject the idea that these games should be measured in terms of whether or not they're profitable. And secondly, profitable for whom? Profitable for McDonald's, profitable for Coca-Cola, profitable for, these corporate sponsors that are the ones who are benefiting from having the games here. And also, I think it's also pretty important to look at the fact that, 84 was very different. It was one of the first times when corporate sponsorship really kind of coalesced around the Olympic Games. It was also, the games were much smaller then. So, the footprint of the games was significantly smaller. So it's much harder to rely on that as a model for profitability going forward. But, ultimately, whether or not they're profitable or not doesn't matter. People are going to be displaced. The police is going to get militarized, and we're not really going to have any say in where that money goes if they are profitable.
If somebody wants to get involved, how can I've been putting up your website, but how can people help you? What kind of tasks are needed?
This has been really exciting over the last 4 weeks to see how the organization has grown in terms of its organizational structure. We have a research team. We have a social media team. We have a press team. We also have an outreach team. And so, if you're somebody who is an organizer or an activist in Los Angeles and you work with or are familiar with an organization that would be sympathetic to our goals and that would want to join on with us as a coalition partner, you should definitely reach out to us and reach out to our outreach team. If you're somebody who studies these kinds of issues and has a lot of information that you want to share with us, you can reach out to our research team. And all of the information about reaching out to us is available on our website. That's www.nolympicsla.com. There's a email list that you can sign up for, and then you can also email organizers from the campaign directly. And if you have talents or skills, or if you just want to show up to an event, you can contact us and join up.
Great. Well, I think this sounds like a great endeavor and one that I know my viewers in Los Angeles are going to be very supportive of. I'm going to thank you for being on my show, and maybe we'll have you on in the future to talk about the progress. And,
thanks so much for having me on, Lauren. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you.
You're very welcome. I hope you all have a great week, and I will see you Tuesday night. Thanks again to my guest, Steve Ducey, and the No Olympics LA movement.